I acknowledge I'm here virtually in conversation with Brit Bennett on the stolen lands of the Bunurong peoples of the Kulin Nation. I acknowledge sovereignty never ceded and treaties are still yet to be signed, and pay respect to elders past, present and becoming, as well as any and all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples who are here with us today. Welcome to the Melbourne Writers Festival. It's pretty strange to be doing this from my house, but it's such an honour to be here nonetheless. I'm sure you're also viewing this from your place, so that feels pretty nice and intimate in this really odd time. My name is Areej. I am a radio producer, presenter and educator based here in Melbourne. I present a weekly show on Triple R called The Wrap, and that's all I'll say about myself, because I really just want to introduce the Brit Bennett, author of this baby right here, which is the best thing that's happened to me this year. Born in Southern California, Brit Bennett graduated from Stanford University and later earned her MFA in fiction at the University of Michigan. She's a National Book Foundation 5 Under 35 awardee, and her debut novel, The Mothers, was a New York Times bestseller. And today we'll be chatting all about her second novel, The Vanishing Half. Brit, welcome.
Hi, thanks for having me.
How you doing?
Doing fine. I've been so lucky to be able to do the type of work that can be done from home and that I've always done from home. So I've been really lucky in that regard, and I'm with my family right now, so I can't complain too much.
It feels so surreal and kind of magical to do this online. I have a bunch of friends in the US and in the UK, and we're always like, our friendship is Afrofuturism, because somehow we off the continent in all of these different countries, and look at us connecting. And I feel like that is a bit of a theme for The Vanishing Half. It's magical, it's surreal, it's real. I'm just going to read a quick bio of it, and then I think we'll just get started.
Okay.
So Stella and Desiree are identical twin sisters. They run away from their small southern town Mallard in search of self-determined futures. Both are light-skinned Black women, and their lives take strikingly divergent paths as one passes as white while the other marries the darkest man she could find. I want to start by asking you about choice. When we think about race, and even the moment we're in with Black Lives Matter, I often think about what isn't in our hands as Black people, why we don't get to choose, and often our race is one of those things. Stella and Desiree got to choose in the end, ultimately, in some way. How can we make sense of all of this being true at the same time?
Yeah, I think that's a huge question, and one that I was interested in as I was writing the book. I am not a person who passes for really anything other than what I appear to be. As far as gender or race or any of these things, I don't know that I've ever been mistaken for some other identity. But I've always been interested in the idea of these identities that are perhaps more ambiguous or that are interpreted in these other ways, and what it actually means to choose in those matters. For example, Stella is a character who begins passing almost accidentally. She is mistaken for something other than what she is. And I put mistaken in quotes because, again, sort of this question of what does it actually mean to be white, Black, like all of those things. I begin, I think, from a position that those are not fixed and obvious things that we all just immediately know what that means. But this idea that she walks, into the store as a Black girl and somebody mistakes her for a white girl, and she kind of just goes with it. And that's was something that was interesting to me, thinking about that character in particular, of how much of that was just sort of happenstance, how much of it was she just kind of found herself in a position and decided to leverage this moment that could be advantageous to herself, or how much of it was an active choice in this act of self-creation. And what does it mean then if we think about identity as something that's that active?
Right. And it's amazing because, it is, essentially at some point, Stella did make some choices. And, maybe this didn't, necessarily kind of fall into her lap only. There was, certainly some active choices. But these decisions that were made were not these huge, profound, life-changing, today I will move on from my old me and I will start a new life. They were gradual and they were slow and they were nuanced. Was that an intentional part of that storytelling for you?
I think so. I am always interested in these small moments that can lead to these huge consequences. And I thought of Stella in that way. I think that a lot of her sort of way of thinking about herself is the sense that she likes to tell herself on one hand that she didn't choose and that these things kind of happened to her. But on the other hand, like you just said, she very much actively chose some of these things. And if she didn't make the initial choice, she certainly chose to continue to live in that life that she ends up in. So I was interested in that contradiction within the character, and also just the idea that we can make these small decisions within our own lives that have unforeseen and large dramatic consequences that affect not only our lives, but also the lives of those in our families and our children and the relatives we haven't even met yet that are yet to come.
One thing that, my favorite character in this book, the narrator, says is that, I guess, when you have successfully passed, that means that nobody knows, which means there's no actual kind of case study of what it means to successfully pass. So how did you do the research for this book?
Yeah, I mean, that's I think one of the most fascinating things about that question to me is that there's no way of knowing all of the people who have passed. It's almost like people who fake their deaths. You only know that someone has faked their death if you discover it. If they get it, they do it successfully, then that means that they have gotten away with it, and you would never know otherwise. So I found that sort of inherent unknowability to be really interesting. And as far as the research, I was able to draw on some nonfiction that had been published about it. There's a book called A Chosen Exile by Alison Hobbs, which is really fascinating. And she kind of delves into the history of passing. But again, these are all people who have either decided to pass no longer, or who have been exposed, or who have been, these are people that you have in some way been discovered. And still there is that type of documented history, but there's also this very hidden history of these people who have not been discovered in some way. And that was what I was interested in writing towards, that kind of hidden history of passing.
There's something like, and I noticed this quite early on when I started reading, there's something like magical and fantastical and kind of fairy tale-like about this kind of epic story that spans, 50 years of life and several generations. And even just this, even just using twins, I always find twins to just be so magical in lots of ways. Using them in this book was so incredibly, like I said, fantastical. And I just thought, these people are, different but the same, and their lives end up different, and their children are different. And all of this kind of comes back to this small town, of only coloured people that isn't on a map, that nobody knows exists. And was that kind of grand fairy tale type story something that you were looking for when you started working on The Vanishing Half?
I thought I was going to be writing something that would feel more realistic, just because that's the type of writing that I think of myself as doing. I don't think of myself as a particularly imaginative writer. I would have never set out to think that I would write something that could feel that way, magical or anything. I think that once I started writing it, I realized that I was really interested in writing toward myth. And once I started doing that, I think it liberated me. It made me feel that I was sort of committing to, instead of feeling like, oh, this story feels unrealistic, that didn't feel like a slight. That felt like something that I was intentionally writing into and writing toward.
Right. And, it was realistic in many ways, right? The experiences of these characters are absolutely real. The lives that they live are absolutely real. There are so many elements of it that I saw myself in, and I know a lot of people would have seen themselves in, and you may have seen yourself in. But I guess the broader kind of, the coincidences, the meetings, the type of characters that people were just so engaging for me. And I think it's because when I switched it on and looked at reading this book through the lens of this big epic story of, generations where so many things happen and there's so many moving parts, it really kind of made sense to me, because I think that race is such a mystical construct at the end of the day, right?
Yeah. I think so. I think that was also something that I wanted to write towards was, I don't even know if fantasy is the right word, but there is something inherently off kilter about race, and particularly race in the sort of context of this book. That's why I was using air quotes sort of earlier in talking about Stella, because early in the book, Stella asked this question, which is, well, why is this person white and we're not? And that's a question that's sort of, there's no answer to it, It's a legitimate question of where is that line in which, and in places like Louisiana, I mean, this was determined legally of, if you have, if you are 1/32nd Black, if we can find a Black ancestor, how many generations back, then you are legally Black, or, one drop rules, or there are these notions that people have tried to determine to create those sort of boundaries, but there's nothing natural and inevitable about it. There is something, I think, inherently very absurd and off kilter about all of it. So I think, again, that was something that felt like the right way to write into the book. It didn't feel like writing something that felt so strictly realistic or so strictly historical. That didn't feel right for me in thinking about the book. It felt like writing into kind of the inherent sort of, you're sort of slightly kind of lifting off of the ground. Like, you're not floating away, but you're just a little bit off the ground. And that felt like kind of the right place to write the book.
Yeah. And like I said, when I think about race, sometimes I'm really firm and I have a real sense of what's going on. And then sometimes it's so fluid that it becomes confusing to even myself as someone who's visibly racialized. I don't think that I could really pass. But it becomes quite fluid. And I think, the moment for me where that started to really set with The Vanishing Half was when I started to really think about Kennedy and Jude, the daughters of these two sisters, these twins, and thinking about what makes Kennedy Black. Or what would make Kennedy Black, right? And, we know what makes Jude Black, but what would make Kennedy Black? And that kind of thinking is what put me in a bit of a spiral, to be honest with you. A lot, but I absolutely felt it. So to you, if you were, thinking about Kennedy and when you were crafting the character of Kennedy, and I want to talk about Jude soon because that's my girl. I really loved her. What would you think would make someone like Kennedy, or how would we define Kennedy's Blackness? And how did Kennedy define herself?
Again, those are all good questions. The way I heard, so I did an event with Gary Young, and he described Kennedy as functionally white with Black heritage. And I don't know that I ever would have used those words, but that was very precise, I think. And I think, as far as, and the other thing I would say to your question is, I don't know how much it matters what we think about Kennedy and how much it matters how she thinks about her Blackness. And that question is also a question I was interested in the book. So does it matter if somebody seeing Kennedy from the outside would not read her as Black? Does that matter? Is that what makes her white or Black, whatever? Is it how she sees herself? Is it how her mother sees her? Her mother sees her as white. So, there are all of these different sort of things that come into it. I think for Kennedy, I was really interested in that journey of discovery and how she experiences this, being exposed to this knowledge about yourself that you had no idea might be coming. I'm always really interested in seeing people who have taken DNA testing to find out their ethnic breakdown. Because, sometimes people find out things that are very different than what they have always believed and also always been told. And there's some people that will reject the new information because they have always lived their lives believing to themselves to belong to some group. And some people will sort of embrace it head on, that this is who I am now. I have now discovered this about, myself. And, for myself, I did like a DNA thing to sort of trace my ancestors back to Africa. And when I didn't know how I would feel finding that information, and I found it and I was like, oh, this is a cool thing that I now know. And that was kind of it. I didn't have really a big sort of emotional connection. It felt like learning a piece of trivia about myself almost, which was not the sort of big emotion I thought I was going to feel. So I think that those types of things are always really fascinating to me. Is this something that will completely change your conception of yourself, or does it just feel like here's a detail about myself that I now know? And I think for Kennedy, she kind of oscillates between those poles. There is this sort of existential crisis that she's experiencing and learning these things about herself that she didn't know, but there's also that part of her that's like, but does it matter? And there's also, I think within that, there's kind of, there's the fact that this is a person who has been socialized as a white woman, and that socialization might be behind some of her resistance to really accept or embrace the fact that she has Black heritage. So I found all of that really fascinating. And I don't know, I think the way that Gary described her is probably the most precise way of describing it. But I think that Kennedy would describe herself as a white woman. And like I said, and the question then is, who am I to say that she's not,
Absolutely. And I guess that's the thing about visibility, right? That's the thing about visible racialization, is that if you have the option, then these questions become a little bit more complicated. But if you don't, then that decision is not made by you. The decision is made by the context in which you are. And I think that, oftentimes we consider these conversations in within privileged discourse. And I think that, of course, colorism and all of that within privileged discourse is really, important, and people can have those conversations. But it's not just that, right? It's not just that, because sometimes you get that internal thing, that sense of self thing, which is like the crux of your humanity. And that's often the last thing we think about when we think about who we are as people. And so, like you said, with Kennedy, I guess it's a matter of where she's at, right? And when. And maybe in a while that it's a thing, and maybe she doesn't. It is what it is.
Yeah. And I also like what you said about when, because that's also something that I find interesting, of, again, this idea of the South being something that is constantly being made and remade and undone. And I think that there is a way in which we don't like to think of race as a category like that. But I think certainly for these characters, they go through these journeys of racial sort of reinterpretation throughout the book. And Kennedy, the way that she feels about race is something that is changing over time. And I imagine if she was out there still living, that is something that would be continually changing within her. So I wanted to write about passing from the state that these identity categories are within themselves fluid and also unstable and also unclear. Because I think that, again, we like to assume that when we look at somebody, we can immediately tell their gender, we can immediately tell their race, we can immediately tell their age, all these other things. We don't know. We're all guessing, and I wanted to think about what it means to pass within that standpoint.
Yeah. And I guess, when we think about the context and the time, segregation is very much about living in binary terms. And the book kind of throws, the binary out of the window. It complicates it, whether it's race, whether it's gender, whether it's class, and kind of developing into a certain class, and whether that aligns with your race. It's a reminder of the details and a reminder of the fluidity. Do you think that matches the type of conversations that are being had in 2020, or do you think we're still kind of stuck within those binaries and kind of trotting along?
Yeah, I think we're still wrestling within the binaries. I think that there's definitely a greater, evolution within the language, at least, of thinking beyond those binaries, or maybe just complicating the binaries more. I think we certainly have more of a language for that now than people did in the time in which I was writing about these characters. But I still think there are ways in which people can be wedded to these binaries because they're simple and there's something nice about simplicity. And there's something easy about that. and to allow that people are complicated, that's something that it can be like stressful and scary to think about. It's easier just to categorize people and to think, I treat, group A like this, and I treat group B like that, and that becomes easy. But I think, as you said, Jim Crow in itself is a system of binaries. Are you white? Are you colored? This is what bathroom you use. And I wanted to think about, this writing into that era of binaries from, again, my 21st century perspective as a writer, in which, I'm rejecting those binaries altogether. And then what does it mean to think about passing from one group to a next if you reject that binary as even being sort of this real thing, and a sense of it having this kind of this meaning that cannot be sort of complicated, or that it's real in the sense that it has these effects on the lives of these characters, and I never wanted to lose sight of that. But at the same time, it's a construct. It's something that we have created, and something that we uphold, and something that because we uphold it, we can also divorce ourselves of it if we wanted to.
Right. I want to talk about Jude, because I actually was texting with a friend the other day, and she just started reading. She still hasn't finished The Vanishing Half, and all she said to me was, "Protect baby Jude at all costs." And I was like, "Yeah,
yes,
absolutely." I feel as Jude is a special character to me, and she's compassionate, she's multi-layered. The relationship with Reese also shatters this binary conversation that we are constantly having, and she's just she's just an absolutely beautiful character, and I loved everything about her. She was complicated, she was compassionate, she was passionate, she was caring, she was insecure, right? She's experienced a lot. Where was your head at when you were crafting Jude? Because she really just was like my heart and the heart to me.
I'm glad. I think Protect Baby Jude was definitely something that was in the forefront of my mind. I don't think I originally thought that she was going to be such a big part of the book, although I knew in the beginning I wanted to open with Desiree returning with Jude. And I think what I first thought was that, okay, we're going to see Jude as she's a child growing up in this place where she is, abused for being dark skinned. And then as I started writing those scenes, it felt a little obvious. It felt, I think at the moment that you read that first section that Desiree has returned with this dark child and you see how people react to her, from that point it's bad, that it's not going to be great that she's growing up there. So that felt a little obvious to me. And then I started to think, okay, well, what's Jude like when she's 20? What's she like when she's 25? What's she like after she has left this town? And that's where she became a lot more dynamic to me. Because I think in the beginning, it felt like she was kind of this punching bag, she was this child that was just receiving all of this abuse. And what I wanted to think about more was knowing that is baked into her past. How does she try to break free of that? How does she handle these insecurities? How does she try to liberate herself from this really toxic ideology that she has been subjected to for her entire life, that has shaped how she sees herself, that has hindered her in these relationships because she cannot imagine somebody loving her? How can she try to overcome this? And that was when she became really dynamic to me as a character. So I wanted, I thought of her as, she's kind of carries the baton of the story forward in a lot of ways. And I think extends kind of Desiree. Desiree is this character in the beginning is kind of rejecting the mythos of Mallard. And Jude takes that even further as she leaves this place and tries to figure out how to really free herself of this town.
I want to kind of come back to this idea of choice that I started out with, because I think that what happens with Stella and Desiree is, of course, like we said, based on some decisions, and there's some choices in there, and not to kind of pathologize why one ended up here and why one ended up there, or why this one's life is like this and why this one's life is like this. It's very clear that the decision-making, whether intentional or not, or subconscious or not, was in relation to an incredibly traumatic experience of their childhood, right, with their dad. How did you navigate creating kind of a world and a life for these people in relation somewhat to that trauma in writing a book?
Yeah, I mean, I think the way you described it is exactly right. I wanted to think about these twin sisters' lives splitting in these really dramatic ways, and thinking about this moment. The sort of, I remember as I was working on it, the scene where they witness their father's attack is, I just titled it, the twins split, like in that section as I was working on the book, because I really thought of that as a moment where they begin to become their separate selves very dramatically. There is like this little sentence of where both of them put their hand on the other's mouth because they don't want the other to scream. And it's a moment where neither knows what the other is going to do for the first time ever. They're both in this horribly traumatic, but also really unpredictable and dangerous situation. And they begin to see the other really as very separate from themselves. So I wanted to think of that as kind of this moment where they begin to go on their separate paths. And I think you do see them respond very differently to this moment of trauma. Desiree ends up actually returning to the house where this violence happened. She returns to the actual scene of the crime, and she ends up staying there for most of her life. Stella is this character who is always kind of running from that trauma, and she's always trying to find some way to protect herself and to sort of create this life for herself where she's, like this princess in a tower, so no one can get to her and no one can hurt her, which is very different than Desiree, who kind of leans into that moment of trauma. So I think what you said was right about not wanting to pathologize it. I just wanted to think about the way that their lives are shaped by this trauma that they witness, and also not only that, but how they also then pass that on to their children, who both have a very different relationship to that trauma.
Yeah, and even in terms of, their decision-making, right, and going kind of back to this point of choice, which I guess is clearly, now that I'm talking to you about it, has been a big theme for me. I think that, essentially their choices were quite narrow, right? The outcomes were really vast, but these women, their choices were narrow. At the end of the day, they were, and they are, Black women in this time period. And unfortunately, their choices were very much in relation to who they end up with, right? Mm-hmm.
Yeah. I mean, I think that's a really important point too. They don't have a lot of options available to them. Stella, to some extent sort of marries well. And that's something, that ends up kind of helping her, even if she had met, if she'd met a poor white man, like her life would have turned out really differently, So she happens to marry a white man, but also a white man who comes from a lot of family money, and that positions her in a certain way. Desiree, on the other hand, ends up in this very abusive marriage, and that's what drives her back home at the beginning of the book to live with her mother again. So I think that's true. I think that there were not a lot of options available to them. They both make the best choice that they can in that moment, or what they perceive to be the best choice. And I just wanted to write about the two of them in a way that didn't feel judgmental. I didn't want to judge either of them for the choices that they made. I didn't want to moralize. I just wanted to explore the aftershocks of these choices on their lives and in the lives of their daughters.
To go back to Stella for a minute, Stella learning how to be white. Like, I felt like I was a fly on the wall of all these conversations that I've always wanted to know what a group of white people say together in a room when I'm not there. You know what I mean? I've never been able to just walk in and just, maybe hear something a little bit off. And so, these scenes of her with these women was like me as a fly in the wall of these conversations. She had to learn to be white, right? She grew up Black. She grew up in this community of super, super light-skinned, special Black people. But at the end of the day, she didn't grow up around white people, and she did have to learn how to be white, and that was ever changing, right? The time period that she was learning to be white was, a very complicated time period for, but also a very complicated time for white people.
Yes.
Time period for white people. How did you write that, and did you enjoy it?
Yeah, of course I enjoyed it. I think what you said is exactly accurate, of that it was a process of education for her. And what I loved about writing Stella, learning how to be white, is that she's always kind of doing it wrong. As you were saying, she didn't grow up around white people. And also she certainly didn't grow up around the type of white people that she eventually sort of ingratiates herself toward. She grows up in rural Louisiana, and the type of white people that she's experiencing are subjugating her in this very obvious, sort of blatant way. And then she, marries this kind of, wealthy white guy, coastal elite, as they say. And, they end up in this really nice neighborhood in LA. And suddenly now she has to be that type of white woman. And, his mother looks down on her because she thinks that she's sort of a trashy white person. And, and even as you're saying, the time period in which this is set, she later has a daughter, who has a black boyfriend. And Stella doesn't respond appropriately to that because she doesn't like it. So I loved that idea of race as performance, and also a performance in which the scripts are constantly changing for everybody. And in which there are penalties of performing race wrong. And obviously the sort of the cost of those penalties is different depending on who you are. But there are social penalties that Stella sort of suffers from performing whiteness incorrectly. But again, like you said, she has no way of knowing how to correctly perform the type of whiteness that she is asked to perform, because she's never experienced that world. And now she's sort of thrust into it, and she has to just learn on the fly. So it was very fun to write and to imagine this person having to try to keep up this act with no basis and no context of knowing how to do it.
It is, one of those things that I have spoken to. I have a few friends who are white passing, and I have spoken to them, about working into the workplace of people not really knowing who they are or who their people are or whatever that might be, and people getting a little bit too comfortable until they tell them. And then once they tell them, it's like you've got a rug from under them, and they can't believe that you managed to kind of infiltrate this safe white space with whatever, whether that is intentional or whether we're kind of doing the most when we talk about that. It's a conversation that we have quite often, right? And it's also really difficult, because I think for people who do pass as white but identify as black or a person of color, every time the safe white space is open to them, it is kind of a little bit of a denial of who they are as people, and that can be quite jarring and can be quite difficult. Yeah.
I think so. And I think also I imagine having to constantly define yourself or having to constantly translate yourself. Again, like I said, I've never walked into a room and had somebody not know whether I was black, So I know immediately when people are reacting to me a certain way that it's because they are reading me as a black woman. But I imagine that being in that space where you don't know, is this person just friendly or do they think I'm white? That sort of back and forth, I imagine would be really difficult and psychologically and emotionally to deal with. I wanted to write towards that. Again, imagining it. It's not something I've ever experienced. I wanted to write towards it with a sense of compassion. I think also a sense of awareness that I think, at least particularly in the time period in which the book is set, I couldn't blame Stella for wanting to pass. I couldn't blame her for making that choice, because you think about all of the things in which she has experienced and witnessed and sort of the narrowness of the life available to her as a black woman in that time and place. And it was hard for me from my, again, 21st century perspective to really cast any blame on her for making that choice.
Yeah. And I guess, the decision to pass in lots of literature and lots of these conversations is one that is, maybe shameful or, morally wrong or, whatever it might be. And that's projected on people who decide to do that or who are able to do that. And so it did feel really nice reading this and not judging Stella and not judging Desiree either, right? At the end of the day, they, chose what they chose based on what made sense to them in the moment and the type of life that they anticipated. Nobody knows what the future holds, right? Nobody knows what's going to happen tomorrow. I mean, 2020, July is a perfect example of that. Like, we don't know what's going to happen in terms of that. So, yeah, it was actually really nice to read this and not feel the pressure of being a judgmental reader. Sometimes you're pushed to judgment and feel the need to do that. And I just kind of, sat with these characters and related to them in whichever way made sense. And it felt nice to not have to cast one aside and say that they were bad just because.
Yes, thank you. No, thank you. I appreciate that. That's what I hoped that readers would take away from it. I think these stories of passing are, so deeply American, I think, because they relate to our sort of American mythology of creating yourself. There's something that really relates to this thing that Americans like to believe about ourselves, which is that you can be whoever you want to be here. And at the same time, like you said, there's often so much judgment in those stories, which is you can be whoever you want to be, but not this. You cannot attain whiteness, or you cannot step outside of whatever class in which you've been subjugated to gain more access to privilege. And I've always felt that there was something really strange about that contradiction within the sort of American mythology and within the American literature that involves passing. So I didn't want to kind of reiterate that. I didn't feel like passing is something that was deserving of punishment, as if it were, sort of morally wrong. I didn't want to issue that type of a judgment. I just really wanted to think about what would it mean to live in this new world and to create this new self and have to leave behind everyone you've ever known and loved. And there's a way in which I imagine that just, moving somewhere and starting over would be entirely liberating. And also a way in which I imagine it would be extremely painful. And I just wanted to think about how that character would move between those two types of emotion.
Yeah. And, when I think about all of these ideas about race and, the construct of race, about racism and how we experience that. And, one thing that, the Vanishing Half did for me was remind me of the little things in our personalities, the little things in our character, in our nature that, of course, in many ways might be defined by the experiences that we have as people and the history and the context in which we live. But there are different elements of our character and our personhood and our humanity that are actually not necessarily related to our racial makeup or our gender or whoever we might be. And sometimes they are, and oftentimes they are the defining parts of who we are in many ways, and our experiences and our decision making. And it just, it can be really difficult to experience racialization and be bogged down by race when oftentimes it's not your choice. And so one thing that was really beautiful for me in reading this is that, yes, all of that, but also all of this, all of your humanity, all of you as a person, all of your little things and the big things, and they're equally important. Was that something that you thought about when you were writing it?
I mean, I think so. I wanted to, and also like not only to think about sort of the experience of race as something that often comes with, the baggage, as you're saying, of racism or these experiences that can be so negative. I also wanted to think about the idea of race as something that also shapes our families. It shapes our intimate relationships of who we marry or who our kids are, what our kids look like. It shapes the jobs we work and where we live and who we live next to. It's something that is connected to all of, it's connected so intimacy within our lives. So I wanted to think about the experience of race in that way too. And also the ways in which Stella, this idea that once Stella has passed, what she misses, she gains all of these sort of, privileges, she gains money, she gains wealth and power. But at the same time, she is so alone in this new world. She constantly feels, I heard somebody describe her once as a fugitive. And that's essentially how she moves through this world, is she's constantly afraid of being discovered and being sort of hunted and found out. And beyond that, she just loses a sense of community that she once had. And I think that is something that also comes along with these experiences of race. So once she has moved out, she kind of ends up in this sort of kind of no man's land where she doesn't feel at home when she's with white people, and that's who she is supposed to be with. And she certainly feels very out of place when she's around Black people. So that's something also that she continues to grapple with once she has made this very drastic choice.
Yeah, absolutely. When I think about Desiree and Desiree's experience of kind of coming back home and coming back to her life, essentially, and also taking on that role as, a carer in many ways of her mother as she gets older, and her partnership and all of those kind of life experiences that seem, probably closer to what she sees for herself, and what she maybe, I don't know if it was what she anticipated for herself, but I don't know if it's necessarily so far-fetched to what people would imagine from their childhood living in Mallard, right? Whereas Stella's life, so out there and out of the construct of what is expected, that, it was unsettling at times when I was reading it.
That sounds right.
Yeah. What are you up to now? So we've done this thing, we've released this book, the pandemic and global protests, and there are lots of Black Lives Matter reading lists, and there's lots of all of that stuff. Is the Vanishing Half one that you expect people to really, really relate back to the experience that they're having now and the time of now? Or are you thinking that it might just be something that takes us out of the world of now for a moment and kind of transports us over there into that world?
I mean, I think either or both. I think it was strange. I think the time in which the book came out, coming out in this moment, was obviously not anything I ever foresaw. And, I started writing the book in, 2014, 2015. And I never thought that, the week the book came out, at least in the US, was sort of when everybody started passing around these reading lists, or that this book might end up on them as something that people could read to engage with race and identity in a different way. So I do think that there is something about the warm reaction to this book that feels connected to this moment. But at the same time, it also, is a book that opens in the 1960s. And I think that the joy it might give somebody now reading as a form of escapism is that they're, I think, one, it is about these characters loving each other across distance and space and time. And I think that's something that we're all dealing with right now, of not necessarily being able to physically be with the people that we care about. But I think also it's a book that takes place in a lot of different locations. If you can't travel right now, it'll maybe allow you to sort of, satiate that part of your brain that wants to be outside of your living room, like many of us right now. So I think there's that element. There is not social distancing. There are parties in the book. So I think that there might also be some element of escapism that you can find in this book that will take you out of this moment a bit.
It was an absolutely beautiful read for me. I think, I read a lot, and, sometimes a book is brought to me, as in, the Melbourne Writers Festival brought this book to me, literally delivered this book to me. And I absolutely loved it from cover to cover. It was beautiful because also it was long, and I love to love a long book, right? It's so enjoyable to know that it's not just about to be over soon. Love to love a long book. So I'm really thankful to you for creating this and for bringing it to us at this time, because I think I personally needed it, and it was absolutely beautiful. I'm really thankful to you for that.
Thank you. I'm so glad you enjoyed it. And thanks. It was great talking to you.
Thank you for bringing Jude to life. Actually, that's my big thanks. Thank you for bringing Jude to life.
Thank you.
Brit Bennett, it's been a joy chatting with you. Hopefully we can do this in person with a new book in a couple of years or next year, whenever you feel like it.
Yes, I hope to be back in Australia soon. Thank you.